You stand barefoot upon the unyielding stone floor, the cold rising through your bones as the candlelight quivers against the time-worn walls. You are but 12 years of age. The weight of a heavy velvet gown hangs upon your slight frame, every stitch a chain fastening you to a destiny decreed long before your first breath was drawn. Tonight, you are no longer a child. Tonight, you bear the title of queen, yet no authority in the realm can shield you from that which awaits beyond the chamber doors. This is not an evening of tenderness or romance. It is a rite, a transaction, inscribed in flesh, designed to bind kingdoms together regardless of the fear coiled within your heart. Beyond, in the corridors, courtiers murmur in hushed anticipation, awaiting proof of consummation. Within, the shadows stand as silent witnesses. This night will alter the course of your life irrevocably. It is the unrecorded history of innocence bartered for power, and of fear adorned with a crown. The wind swept through the high corridors of the royal keep, carrying with it the salt and damp from the sea beyond. In the great hall below, the feast was dying down, the minstrels' songs turning slow and soft, the laughter of lords dimming as wine dulled their tongues. The stone walls seemed to absorb the fading mirth, holding instead the low hum of private conversations, the clink of goblets being set aside. High above them, in a chamber lit only by 3 wavering candles, Queen Isabel of Aragon stood by a window slit. Her hands were pressed together until the knuckles whitened, the skin pulled taut over bone. The chill air seeped through the narrow opening, biting at her cheeks. She was 12 years old, but she understood in the way children of royal blood are forced to understand that her life was no longer hers to command. From the moment she could walk, Isabel had been prepared for this day. Tutors drilled her in French, Latin, and Catalan, until her tongue ached from shaping words that were not her own. Ladies of the court schooled her in the art of silence, in how to lower her eyes at the precise moment that pleased a man's pride, how to laugh softly without showing teeth, how to appear delicate without seeming weak. She learned that a queen's strength was a quiet one, felt but not flaunted. At her betrothal 2 years before, she had smiled for the painters, her cheeks stiff from holding the expression. She had bowed to bishops whose prayers were spoken in words she could repeat but never quite believed. She had stood beside the man who would be her husband, King Charles II of Naples, and tried to memorize his face, though it felt as distant to her as the moon. He was twice her age, a man who had already seen battlefields, signed treaties, and buried one wife. To him, she was not a child. She was a key to ports, to lands, to alliances sealed in ink and blood. The wedding ceremony that morning had been a blur of incense smoke, bells ringing in the rafters, and the droning cadence of Latin vows. She had memorized them as one might memorize a hymn, never truly considering their meaning. The crown, heavy with gold and jewels, pressed so sharply into her scalp that she feared her neck would give under its weight. When the final blessing was spoken and the lords cheered, she had felt nothing but a hollow ache, a sense that something irreversible had taken place, and she could never return to the world she had known. Now, as the remnants of the feast below faded into murmurs, the truth of the night drew closer. Her ladies moved quietly around her, their gowns whispering against the rushes on the floor. One loosened the stiff velvet of her wedding dress. Another brushed out her long hair until it fell over her shoulders like a dark river. They replaced the gown with a linen chemise, thin enough that the candlelight showed the faint outline of her frame beneath. They whispered blessings in voices meant to soothe, but their eyes avoided hers. It was as though they feared to meet the gaze of a child about to cross into womanhood, not by choice, but by decree. Isabel wanted to ask them what they had felt on their wedding nights, if they too had been afraid. But something in their averted glances told her the answer, and the words caught in her throat. When the door opened, the sound seemed louder than the music downstairs. Charles stepped inside, his tread measured, his presence filling the chamber. He smelled faintly of spiced wine and the smoke from the torches that lined the hall. His eyes sharp, assessing swept over her, not unkindly, but with the assurance of a man who had already decided what would happen. Servants moved quietly behind him, drawing back the bed curtains. Isabel's breath quickened. Her gaze flicked toward the narrow window slit. Beyond it lay the open night, the dark waters, and the far-off shore she would never walk again. She thought of running, but where could she go? She was a queen now, and queens do not run. The bed loomed large in the candlelight, its heavy posts casting long shadows across the floor. The air thickened. The sounds from the great hall faded entirely, replaced by the beating of her own heart. She knew there would be no escape, no delay. Her body was a seal on a bargain struck months ago, and nothing in heaven or earth would unmake it tonight. No chronicler wrote of the tears she might have shed, nor of the tremor in her hands as she climbed into the bed. The official record would note only that the marriage was consummated, that the alliance was sealed. The ink of history had no room for the breathless fear of a 12-year-old girl. And so, in the flicker of 3 wavering candles, Isabel learned the first truth of queenship. Power belonged to others, but its cost would be paid in her flesh. The winter after Isabel's wedding settled over Naples like a shroud. The air in the stone corridors turned damp, the fire in the hearths never quite reaching the cold lodged in the walls. Outside, the city's narrow streets bustled with merchants, beggars, and soldiers returning from the southern campaigns. Inside the castle, life unfolded at a slower, heavier pace, governed by ritual and watchful eyes. Isabel quickly learned that marriage did not grant her freedom. It replaced one prison with another. The great hall, where she once imagined she might reign beside her husband, became a stage for politics. Every meal, every dance, every exchange of glances was observed and interpreted. The courtiers' whispers trailed her like shadows. Charles, her husband, was courteous but distant. He rarely spoke to her unless others were present. When he did, his words were practical questions about her health, instructions on which noblewomen she should entertain, reminders to attend certain ceremonies. To him, she was a necessary ornament, proof of his alliance with Aragon. Their nights together were brief and formal, a duty to be fulfilled rather than a bond to be nurtured. Her days were filled with instruction. The Queen Dowager, Charles's mother, oversaw her training in courtly etiquette. Every move was rehearsed, the way she entered a room, the exact angle at which to incline her head when addressed by a bishop, how to maintain composure when insulted, for there would always be insults, veiled as compliments, from women who envied her youth, and men who measured her worth in coin and territory. Isabel began to see the machinery of power more clearly. She noticed how a single nod from her husband could change the tone of an entire council meeting, how the arrival of a sealed letter could turn an evening feast into a war council. She also noticed how little her own voice mattered in these affairs. One evening, she was summoned to the council chamber. The long oak table was strewn with parchments, maps, and heavy seals stamped in red wax. Around it sat Charles, his most trusted lords, and the Archbishop. Isabel stood quietly at the far end, her hands clasped before her, as they discussed a proposed treaty with the Kingdom of Sicily. The words washed over her: tariffs, fortifications, trade routes, until the Archbishop mentioned her name. Her gaze sharpened, and as part of the agreement, the Archbishop continued, "The Princess Maria, your sister, will be sent here to wed the Duke of Calabria. In exchange, the Duke's younger brother will be wed to..." He looked at Isabel briefly. "Your future daughter." A future daughter. The words sank into her like ice. She realized then that her own marriage was not the end of the bargain. She was a link in a chain stretching far ahead, binding children not yet born to treaties, not yet written. When the council adjourned, Charles dismissed her with a polite nod. As she turned to leave, one of the younger lords, his smile thin as a blade, murmured, "You see, Your Majesty, even the womb of a queen is a weapon." That night, Isabel lay awake long after the candles had burned low. She thought of her sister, still in their father's court, unaware of the future being decided for her. She thought of the girl she herself had been standing in the cold corridor before her wedding night, and understood now that her fear had been only the first step into a lifetime of surrender. By spring, rumors began to circulate. Whispers that Charles was planning another campaign in the south, that he had promised certain noble families more land, more titles, that he had written to the Pope requesting special dispensations, matters the Queen was never told directly but always felt the weight of. It was during this time that Isabel began to withdraw. She spent more hours in the castle's small chapel, where the flicker of candles on the carved altar offered a kind of silence no courtier could intrude upon. She ran her fingers over the cold stone of the walls, tracing patterns in the centuries-old carvings. In those moments, she could almost forget the constant watchfulness, the invisible hands arranging her life like pieces on a chessboard. But even there, she was not free. The priest reminded her, in his slow, deliberate sermons, that a queen's duty was not only to her husband, but to God, and God's will, of course, was often indistinguishable from the will of powerful men. When the war came, it came suddenly. Riders brought news of skirmishes in the south. The council met daily, their debates growing heated. Charles grew restless, spending more time in the training yards, less in her chambers. Isabel heard his voice through the stone walls at night, not speaking to her, but to his generals. One evening, she stood at the high window of her chambers and looked out over the courtyard. Soldiers in chainmail moved like a river of steel below. Among them, she saw the Duke of Calabria, the man meant to marry her sister, mounting his horse. Their eyes met briefly, and in his expression, she read the same resignation she carried. It was then she understood the second truth of queenship. Alliances are written in blood long before the first drop is shed. The war dragged on for 2 years. Messengers arrived at the castle gates with news that shifted from triumph to disaster and back again. Isabel bore 2 children during this time, both boys. Their births were celebrated not for her sake, but for the assurance they brought to the succession. Her role became one of preservation. She maintained the court in Charles's absence, overseeing feasts to honor allies, receiving envoys from distant realms, and most importantly, keeping the lords from turning on each other in the king's absence. It was a delicate balance, and she learned quickly how to wield the tools available to her: patience, charm, and the quiet suggestion of reward or ruin. When Charles returned, older and harder from the campaign, Isabel thought perhaps her service would earn her some measure of respect. But victory had made him impatient. He sought new conquests, new alliances, and she was once again a piece in the game. The final blow came in her 16th year. The Pope himself wrote to Charles, suggesting that a union between their eldest son, a boy of barely 3, and the daughter of the French king would be most advantageous for Christendom. Isabel was summoned to the council chamber, but not to give her opinion. She stood by as the men spoke of her child's future, trading away his life as they had hers. That night, she walked alone through the cold stone corridors to the chapel. The moonlight slanted through the high windows, casting silver bars across the floor. She knelt before the altar, not to pray, but to think. She saw in her mind's eye the chain of women before her: queens, princesses, duchesses, each bound by duty, their names remembered not for who they were, but for whom they married, for the heirs they bore, for the treaties their bodies sealed. She thought of the girl she had been, standing in the flicker of 3 candles on her wedding night, and realized she had never truly left that chamber. Years later, when she stood at the high window of the castle, looking out over fog-draped lands, she felt no triumph. The wars had come and gone. Kings had died. Sons had grown into men shaped by others' ambitions. She had played her role to perfection, and still her life belonged to the ledger of alliances, not to herself. And so she understood the final truth of queenship. History does not remember the fear of the woman, only the power of the crown she wore. If history has taught us anything, it's that behind every gilded crown lies a story the chronicles don't tell. Stories of women who paid the price for power with their youth, their freedom, and sometimes their very souls. If you want to uncover more of these untold truths, subscribe and join me as we bring the shadows of history into the light.